Who let the civilian play with our rifles? The snickers echoed as a small woman quietly adjusted her stance at the military range. Contemptuous eyes stared another outsider among real Marines. But when her sleeve slid back, exposing the faded SEL team tattoo on her wrist, the entire range fell silent. The SEAL commander froze mid-stride. Who was she? And why did one old tattoo make a hardened Special Forces commander stop in his tracks? Riley Shaw was 32 years old and professionally invisible. 4 years ago, she'd been someone entirely different, someone whose name appeared in classified after-action reports that would be sealed for decades. Someone who'd earned the right to wear the SEAL trident through trials that broke most people before they even began. Now she was nobody special, a quiet woman who worked as a firearms technician at a small gun repair shop, fixing weapons for hunters and weekend warriors who had no idea what real combat looked like. Her military records were mostly sealed. What remained was just paperwork, honorable discharge, medical leave, standard bureaucratic language that revealed nothing about missions that officially never happened, or teammates who'd paid the ultimate price in places that didn't appear on any map. Today, her friend Marcus had convinced her to visit Fort Brixton's rifle range. "Come on, Shaw, you miss it, don't you? Just watching, that's all." Sure, she'd said no 3 times before finally agreeing, mostly because Marcus wouldn't stop asking, and partly because some buried part of her did miss the familiar weight of military-grade weapons and the precision that had once defined her existence. The range was busy with Marines running basic marksmanship drills, young faces, eager voices, the kind of enthusiasm that came from thinking you understood what combat meant based on training scenarios and simulator exercises. Rayleigh stood at the far end, trying to blend into the background. But a woman in civilian clothes at a military firing range was like a neon sign, impossible to ignore, especially when that woman looks small enough that the recoil from a standard issue rifle might knock her down. "Mind if I borrow this?" she asked quietly, gesturing toward an unattended M4 carbine. The range safety officer glanced at her civilian clothes and shrugged. "Knock yourself out. Just don't embarrass yourself." Riley picked up the weapon with movements that were too smooth, too automatic for someone who supposedly worked on guns. Rather than firing them, she chambered around, adjusted her stance, and took aim at a target 200 meters downrange. No practice shots, no sight adjustments, just the calm breathing pattern that had served her through sniper training and close quarters combat in places where one mistake meant death for your entire team. 5 shots in rapid succession. The sound was crisp, controlled, each round fired with mechanical precision that spoke of thousands of hours of training and years of experience that couldn't be faked. When the shooting stopped, Rayleigh lowered the weapon and set it carefully on the bench. At the distant target, a single ragged hole marked where all 5 bullets had clustered dead center in the bullseye. The Marines who'd been watching fell silent. Even their instructor stopped mid-sentence, staring down range at shooting that exceeded military sniper standards by a considerable margin. "Probably just lucky," one of the younger Marines muttered, but his voice carried uncertainty rather than conviction. Rayleigh said nothing. She'd learned long ago that explanations usually made situations more complicated than they needed to be. Better to let people draw their own conclusions, even when those conclusions were completely wrong. But as she rolled up her sleeves to better handle the warm rifle, the fabric shifted just enough to reveal something that changed everything. A koto, faded tattoo on her left wrist, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. The SEAL Team 9 trident, with scars running parallel to the ink, marks that only came from the kind of training that had a casualty rate higher than most people knew existed. Commander Blake Harrison was walking past the civilian section when he caught sight of the impossible shooting display. He'd been planning to ask whoever had produced such exceptional marksmanship about their background. That's when he spotted the tattoo, and that's when he realized he wasn't looking at a civilian at all. A group of young Marines gathered around the target display, staring at Riley's impossible shot grouping. "Must have been beginner's luck," one recruit said, loud enough for her to hear. "Let's see if she can do that again, or if it was just a fluke." Another Marine snickered. "Maybe she's better at hitting paper targets than taking selfies." "That's about all civilians are good for these days." Riley ignored them, but the words triggered memories she'd spent 4 years trying to bury. Night operations in hostile territory, teammates who trusted her to cover their backs, the weight of responsibility. That came with being the only thing standing between success and catastrophe. She'd heard variations of this mockery her entire military career from instructors who thought women had no place in special operations to enemy combatants who'd underestimated her until it was too late. The doubt and dismissal were nothing new. What was new was how much it still stung after all this time. "You know what I think?" a female Marine said, stepping closer with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never faced real danger. "I think she's one of those military groupies, probably watches many movies and thinks she knows what real fighting looks like." The group laughed, their voices carrying across the range with casual cruelty. They saw exactly what Riley wanted them to see: a small, quiet woman playing dress-up with equipment she didn't understand. If only they knew what she'd sacrificed to earn the right to hold that rifle. The memories came unbidden: sand and blood and the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. The feeling of a sniper rifle in her hands as she provided overwatch for extraction teams. The moment when everything went wrong and heroism became a liability. When saving lives became grounds for discharge. Riley gripped the M4 tighter, her sleeve riding up slightly to reveal more of the faded tattoo. The SEAL Team 9 trident looked like nothing special to untrained eyes, just old ink that had lost its sharpness over the years. But to those who knew what to look for, it was documentation of service in a unit that recruited from the top 1% of an already elite force. "Let's give her another chance," the first Marine said mockingly. "Maybe she can tell us all about combat tactics she learned from video games." More laughter, more assumptions, more evidence that some lessons could only be learned through experience. That most people would never survive. Riley had started to respond when Commander Blake Harrison appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't heard him approach, which was impressive considering her training had made her hyper-aware of potential threats from any direction. "Interesting shooting," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that came with decades of military service. "Thank you, sir," Riley replied, not looking up from the rifle she was carefully cleaning. Blake's eyes moved from her face to her hands, noting the efficiency of her movements, the familiarity with the weapon that spoke of extensive training. Then his gaze dropped to her wrist, where the sleeve had pulled back enough to reveal the tattoo. That's when everything changed. Blake had been with SEAL teams for 15 years. He'd served with some of the most elite warriors in the American military, had seen courage and confidence in forms that most people couldn't imagine. But the tattoo on Riley's wrist wasn't just any SEAL insignia, it was Team 9, with scars running parallel to the ink. Blake knew that combination. He'd heard whispers about it in the kind of conversations that happened in secure facilities, stories that were passed down through the SEAL community like legends. Stories about a female operative with the call sign Ghost who'd completed missions that existed only in classified files. Someone who'd survived an operation in the Zagros Mountains that had officially never happened. Someone who'd extracted hostages from a situation that military planners had written off as impossible. Someone who'd disappeared from active duty after an incident that raised more questions than it answered. Blake studied Riley's face, comparing it to memories of briefings and half-glimpsed photographs in folders marked with classifications above. His clearance level, the quiet confidence, the way she moved, the shooting that exceeded standards most military snipers couldn't achieve. "My God," he whispered, barely audible. "It's really you." The Marines who'd been mocking Riley had gone quiet, Sensing that something significant was happening but lacking the context to understand what it meant, Riley looked up, meeting Blake's eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd faced down threats that would terrify most people. She didn't confirm or deny his recognition. She didn't need to. The laughter had stopped. The mockery had vanished. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be spoken aloud. It just needs to be seen, etched in skin and scars as a reminder that legends are still walking among us. Do you believe in legends? And what would you do if one day you realized the person standing right in front of you was a living legend? The laughter died, the jeers faded. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be spoken, it only needs to be seen, etched into skin as a reminder that legends still walk among us. Do you believe in legends? And what would you do if you realized the person standing right in front of you was a living legend? Comment legend if you believe some people's stories are larger than life. Commander Blake took a step closer, his voice dropping to the formal tone reserved for situations that required extreme discretion. Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions privately. Riley nodded once, setting down the M4 with the same careful precision she'd used throughout the encounter. Around them, the Marines had stopped their training exercises, sensing that something significant was unfolding, but lacking the clearance level to understand what it meant. Name? Blake asked quietly. Shaw, Riley Shaw, SEAL Team 9, discharged 4 years ago. The words hung in the air like live ammunition. Blake's face went through several expressions as he processed what he'd just heard. SEAL Team 9 wasn't just another unit. It was the Ghost Squadron, the team that handled operations so classified that their very existence was debated in conspiracy forums. Team 9, Blake repeated slowly. But you're the Ghost of Coronado. Riley finished quietly. Yeah, I know what they call me. The young Marines who'd been mocking her just minutes before now stood in awkward silence, finally understanding that they'd been insulting someone whose combat record probably exceeded their collective experience. The female Marine who'd called her a military groupie had gone pale, as if she'd just realized she'd been making fun of her own hero. Blake studied Rayleigh's face with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile legend with reality. He'd heard the stories, whispered conversations in secure facilities about a female SEAL who'd completed impossible missions and then vanished from active duty under circumstances that raised more questions than they answered. The Zagros operation, he said carefully, testing whether she'd acknowledge details that existed only in the most classified files. Officially never happened, Riley replied with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. 12 hostages extracted from a compound that intelligence said was impenetrable. Turns out intelligence was wrong about a lot of things. Blake nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle he'd never expected to solve falling into place. And the discharge? Rayleigh's expression hardened slightly. Politics. Someone needed to take responsibility when the mission went public. Easier to blame the operator than admit the planning was flawed from the start. The admission carried weight that extended far beyond personal grievance. Blake understood the subtext. Riley had been scapegoated for an operation that had saved lives but embarrassed politicians. Her heroism had become a liability when success became too visible for comfort. The shooting we just witnessed, Blake said, gesturing toward the target downrange. That wasn't luck. No, sir, it wasn't. And the way you handled that weapon muscle memory doesn't fade, even when everything else does. Blake made a decision that would have ramifications far beyond the firing range. He turned to address the Marines who'd been watching the exchange with growing confusion and dawning respect. Listen up, people. You've just witnessed something that doesn't happen often in a military career. You've met a legend. The young Marines shifted uncomfortably, uncertain how to process the transformation of someone they'd been mocking into someone their commander was treating with reverence. This woman, Blake continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned respect through decades of service, completed missions that officially don't exist. She saved lives in situations that military planners had written off as impossible. She served with distinction in a unit that represents the absolute pinnacle of military excellence. Riley remained silent throughout Blake's impromptu speech, her expression neutral. She'd learned that explanations usually made things more complicated, and she had no interest in becoming anyone's inspiration story. But Blake wasn't finished. And she was discharged not because she failed, but because she succeeded too well. Because saving lives became politically inconvenient for people who've never faced real danger. The firing range had gone completely quiet. Even the distant sounds of other training exercises seemed muted, as if the entire base had paused to absorb what was happening. "Ma'am," Blake said, turning back to Riley with genuine respect, "it would be an honor to have you share your expertise with our trainees, if you're willing." Riley considered the offer carefully. For 4 years, she'd avoided anything that might draw attention to her past. She'd learned to be invisible, to let people underestimate her, to accept their assumptions rather than correct their misconceptions. But looking at the faces around her young Marines, who'd gone from mockery to awe in the space of a few minutes, she realized that some knowledge was too valuable to keep hidden. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. "Combat marksmanship, close-quarters tactics, the kind of real-world skills that can't be learned from manuals or simulations." Riley nodded slowly. "I can do that." Blake's smile was the first genuine expression of joy she'd seen from him since their conversation began. "Outstanding. When can you start?" "Now, if you want." Blake turned to the Marines who'd been observing the exchange. "You heard the lady. Form up for advanced training. And I suggest you pay very close attention to everything she tells you." As the Marines scrambled to organize themselves, Blake leaned closer to Riley. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. Do you regret it? The discharge, the loss of recognition, everything you gave up?" Riley looked out across the firing range, watching young Marines prepare for training that might someday save their lives in situations they couldn't yet imagine. "I regret that good people died for bad reasons," she said quietly. "I regret that. Politics matter more than results. But I don't regret doing what was right, even when it cost me everything." Blake nodded, understanding passing between them like shared classified information. "The Marines you're about to train, they're lucky to learn from someone who understands that some things are more important than career advancement." Riley picked up the M4 again, checking the action with movements that spoke of expertise that couldn't be faked or forgotten. "Let's hope they never have to use what I'm going to teach them," she said. "But if they do, they'll be ready." As she walked toward the assembled Marines, Riley felt something she hadn't experienced in 4 years, not vindication. That would require caring about the opinions of people who judged her unfairly, but purpose. The knowledge that her skills, her experience, her hard-won wisdom could still serve something larger than herself. The ghost of Coronado was about to teach the next generation what real warfare looked like. Word spread through Fort Brixton faster than classified information through intelligence channels. Within hours, every Marine, sailor, and officer on the base had heard some version of the story. The details varied, with each telling some said she'd been undercover. Others claimed she'd been testing base security, but the core truth remained constant. The ghost of Coronado had walked among them, invisible and unrecognized, until a moment of casual mockery had revealed who she really was. The Marines, who'd made jokes about military groupies and civilian wannabes, found themselves the subjects of base-wide discussion, not disciplinary action. Riley had specifically requested that none be taken, but the kind of attention that made young soldiers examine their assumptions about who deserved respect. "I keep thinking about how calm she was," one of them confided to his squad leader weeks later, "even when we were being complete jerks. She never lost her composure, like she'd heard it all before and knew something we didn't." Riley herself had settled into an unofficial role as advanced tactics instructor. Commander Blake had made the arrangement permanent within a week, citing the need for real-world expertise in training programs that had become too dependent on simulation and theory. She worked with small groups, teaching skills that couldn't be found in any manual: how to read terrain under stress, how to make split-second decisions when lives hung in the balance, how to maintain accuracy when everything around you is chaos and death. The young Marines approached her training with a reverence that made Riley uncomfortable at first. They hung on every word, took notes on techniques that she'd learned through trial and error in places that didn't appear on any official map. "Ma'am," one recruit asked during a close-quarters combat session, "how do you stay so calm under pressure?" Riley considered the question while adjusting his stance. "Fear keeps you alive," she said finally, "but panic gets you killed. The difference is training until your responses become automatic." "Were you ever scared in combat? I mean." "Every time," Riley replied without hesitation. Anyone who says they weren't is either lying or didn't understand the situation. The honesty was refreshing to Marines who'd been fed a steady diet of bravado and machismo. Riley's approach was different: clinical, precise, focused on survival rather than glory. Stories about her teaching methods began circulating through military networks beyond Fort Brixton. Veteran instructors requested transfers to observe her techniques. Senior officers made unannounced visits to training sessions, quietly taking notes on innovations that exceeded standard military doctrine. A small memorial plaque appeared near the firing range one morning, unofficial and unauthorized, but tolerated by base command. It bore no names or specific references, just a simple inscription: "Honor serves in silence." Nobody claimed responsibility for placing it there, but everyone understood its significance. It represented more than Riley's story; it honored all. The quiet professionals who served without recognition, who carried their achievements like hidden tattoos, visible only to those who knew how to look. Riley noticed the plaque during one of her morning training sessions, but said nothing about it. She'd learned that some gestures were more powerful when left unacknowledged, that respect given freely was worth more than recognition demanded through official channels. The Marines she trained began carrying themselves differently, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence that came from learning skills from someone who'd proven them in situations where failure meant death. They'd been taught by a legend, and it showed in everything they did. 6 months after that first encounter at the firing range, Riley received an offer from the Pentagon: special advisor position, enhanced clearance, the chance to influence training programs across all service branches. She turned it down without explanation. Some legends were meant to remain in the shadows, teaching one Marine at a time. Some legacies don't need grand announcements. The faded tattoo that Riley carried wasn't a trophy to be displayed, or a credential to be flaunted. It was a reminder, to herself and to anyone who discovered it, that true service transcends the circumstances that define it. For 4 years, she lived as a ghost, invisible and forgotten by a system that had once depended on her skills. She'd accepted blame that wasn't hers, carried responsibility for failures that belonged to others, and disappeared into anonymity. Because sometimes the greatest service you can provide is becoming invisible. But invisibility has its limits. When you've earned the right to wear that ink through trials that break most people before they begin, when you've made split-second decisions that saved lives and protected freedoms that others take for granted, when you've sacrificed everything for ideals that politicians barely understand, that kind of achievement doesn't fade just because bureaucrats decide it's inconvenient. Rayleigh's story reminds us that we live surrounded by invisible legends. The quiet woman at the hardware store might have defused bombs in war zones. The unassuming man working construction might have extracted hostages from impossible situations. The reserved person serving your coffee might have made decisions that prevented international incidents. They don't wear their achievements like badges of honor because true honor doesn't require recognition. They don't demand respect because They've learned that respect given freely is worth more than respect extracted through displays of authority. But when circumstances force their true nature into the light, when a sleeve slides back to reveal faded ink, when instincts trained in combat zones become visible to observant eyes, when quiet competence is mistaken for weakness until it can no longer be contained, the revelation changes everything around them. The Marines at Fort Brixton learned that strength comes in forms they'd never been trained to recognize, that courage often looks like calm compliance rather than aggressive confrontation, that the most accomplished warriors are usually the ones who've learned that boasting and bragging are luxuries that professionals can't afford. Riley Shaw walked onto that firing range as a civilian and left as a teacher, not because she demanded recognition, but because circumstances forced the truth of who she was into daylight where it couldn't be ignored. She carried her tattoo, not as proof of what she'd accomplished, but as evidence of what she'd lost and found again in the space between humiliation and respect. The ink meant everything and nothing, a piece of art that represented trials no one else could understand, sacrifices no one else had made, and achievements that would never appear in history books. True warriors serve in silence, but when silence is broken, when truth emerges from hidden places and forgotten corners, the world remembers that honor never really dies. It just waits patiently for the right moment to remind everyone that legends walk among us, teaching one person at a time. Subscribe HC Stories if you believe quiet legacies still carry weight, inked not just on skin, but on history itself.